like it anywhere else.
There's a huge difference between the academics back to my country, the academics here.
You don't have to be afraid to not know something, it's completely fine.
It's more about understanding and exploring, not just learning some concepts, because you have to.
What about problematic areas?
But the best part of UWC is the fact that it's like a whole community with the same spirit.
UWC because it will give you a unique setting and a very loving one for you to learn about yourself, to learn about others, and to learn about the world.
I felt home since the very first day because this community is great.
If you want a multicultural community where all of your ideas, beliefs, and values are respected, and not only that, but explored, you should apply to UWC.
Apply.
Apply now.
Good luck.
So good evening again, Bari Yereko, or good morning to Ani, and good afternoon to people who are in different parts of the world. We continue our workshops within UWC Day event, and I am happy to have Ani with us as our last guest to talk about something very interesting. I will talk about it shortly, but for those of you who do not who join us for the first time during these days workshops, I will just shortly tell you what this whole thing is about. So today, it's September 21st, and there are many occasions that we celebrate within UWC community and not only. First of all, it's UWC Day that coincides with the second occasion, that being United Nations International Day of Peace. Then, particularly for us Armenians, it's our Independence Day, so happy independence. And it's also the 7th anniversary of UWC Dilijan. Now, you know, each year we celebrate UWC Day in our community by thousands of people, students, alumni, UWC friends, as well as UWC college staff and NC staff. And for those of you who don't know, UWC is the global celebration of UWC movement and values, and it gives us a special chance basically to get together and to celebrate it. It serves also as a chance to spread the word about our movement, our work, and values. But it's also an opportunity for us to reflect on what we do as a movement, as people, as community, and to continue to challenge ourselves. So as you may know, every year UWC picks a theme, and this year's theme is Reimagine Tomorrow. And we are organizing different workshops on creativity, on creative thinking and creativity tools. So today we had different workshops. We had beautiful, amazing guests throughout the day, Natasha Kalafyan, Anatoly Kapustin, Sergei Ilyukhin, and now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Ani Muradyan. Ani is UWC Southeast Asia Singapore alumni, class of 2016. She has recently graduated from McGill University, where she studied behavioral neuroscience, psychology, and math. As an aspiring neuroscientist, Ani wants to dedicate her career to developing novel integrative methodologies for investigating and treating various neurological and psychiatric conditions. And in this workshop, Ani will talk to us about the biological basis of the complex and mysterious phenomenon that we call creativity, as modern science can explain it. We will discuss how neuroscientists define and study creativity and how understanding its nature can help us cultivate and develop this quality. Anijan, thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours. Please, let's start. Just a second.
Okay, I can
Yes.
unmute myself. Here we go. Thank you, Rosanna Jen, for your introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us right now. I'm really happy to see so many people online with us. So happy UWC Day, happy Independence Day to my fellow Armenians. And just wanted to say, if you have questions during, because please feel free to write in the chat. I'll try to answer it while I'm explaining everything else, especially if something is not clear. And then in the end, hopefully we'll have time for discussion and any questions that you might have. So I'll just share my screen and we can get started. Okay. Can everyone see? Okay. If something goes wrong, let me know. So creativity is such an interesting topic, and especially in this day and age where we're moving more and more towards an era where thanks to AI, we will be able to automate a lot of jobs that require data gathering and information processing. That's going to be replaced, and it's emphasized more and more that the most important skill is going to be creativity, that people need to be more creative and work with the skill, develop it further. But what does it really entail? In history, I mean, for the longest time, creativity was thought to be outside of the reach of science. We couldn't really explain and understand it well, and it was thought to be a very rare thing. But we'll get into the reasons why that might have happened. But a very broad definition of creativity, I would say, is the ability of making connections and novel associations between different ideas, and also detecting. That's okay. So, okay. So this definition is taken from a book called The Genetics of Creativity. It's not a specific definition, but I think it highlights some very important attributes that we're going to unpack during the presentation. So it says it's important to see creativity is not only an individual ability, but a cultural and time-specific phenomenon that's biologically grounded and has social purpose. So all of these aspects are very important. Okay, so all of these aspects are very important, and we'll get into details of each of this. Okay, so in essence, creativity is problem solving with relevance and novelty. So novelty is really important, right? Because it's all about generating something new that didn't exist before, although it has to be based on foundational knowledge that already exists. We don't just come up with things that are not already associated with all the things in our environment that we know. It's based on the knowledge we have. But it also has to have value and relevancy to the current cultural context. Because if it's something maybe super creative, but the current context and the time period is not ready for that, it might not stick. So the ideas that are considered creative and relevant today need to have that novelty, but also value that's relevant to today. So David Eagleman, he's a neuroscientist professor at Stanford, and he actually has a book on creativity, which I highly recommend because it's for public, it's not heavy on jargon. And he beautifully describes these cognitive strategies that help us create new ideas. And this doesn't explain how that happens biologically, but it is a nice breakdown of what sort of mechanisms might be happening in the background. So three strategies that he highlights called bending, breaking, and blending. So what's the bending part? He describes his original idea, which is twisted out of shape and transformed in some way. So essentially finding a new perspective to looking at something that we already know. Breaking is about breaking it down into its constituents part for further understanding it better and potentially rearranging all of this parts later on. So this is a little more abstract, but I think if you think of any sort of creative ideas, these are very universal processes for that. And then the final part, the blending, is when two or more of the sources are merged, two or more ideas. And the more these ideas are seemingly unrelated, the more creative the idea would seem. But again, this is still kind of abstract. How does this actually happen in the brain? What's the hardware that allows us to achieve this? First of all, there is one thing that I really want to emphasize, because even if you don't remember anything after this presentation, this is one thing that I don't want you to forget. There is this saying always that, oh, there is the right brain, the left brain, and the right one is the creative, artistic, and the left one is more logical. So sometimes like people would describe themselves or someone else as like left brain person, right brain person. So this is just wrong, I want to say. Sorry, but I will clarify that this is highly simplified and mostly inaccurate. The only accurate part is that it's true that there is some functional, what we call lateralization in the brain. So certain functions that are more dominant in one or the other hemisphere. And the most emphasized one is language. It's true that language is dominant in the left hemisphere, which it's a separate topic. We can get into that on a different workshop one day, perhaps. But everything else, this like clear, simplistic distinction is not correct, because creativity is actually such a complex process, and it's about interaction of like multiple brain networks and switch between those like interchangeably. So let's consider this wrong. Let's not have this simplistic view of this and try to understand this phenomenon a little further. So no left brain, right brain, okay? It's the whole brain. It's several very complex networks that make this phenomenon possible. But I want to get into why we humans can do that, and let's say dogs can't fly spaceships to the moon, or squirrels are not going around and making discoveries or whatever. So this is again a simplified version of sort of the functional levels in the brain, but it's helpful to understand, and it is sort of accurate in terms of the research that we currently know. So we separate these 3 levels in the brain. On the right picture, as you can see, this red part is what we refer to as the reptilian brain. Why reptilian? Because even reptilia, let's say lizards, their brain structure is very similar to this structure, which we have in our brains, but it's only a small part of it. And the main function of this structures, or like this group of structures, is essentially a regulatory, important regulatory functions for the body, such as, for example, regulating body temperature, blood glucose levels, or releasing important hormones, and all of that. So the fact that a lot of even other animals have this similar structure is what allows us, neuroscientists, psychologists, to study other let's say, diseases or phenomena in other animal models, but still be able to generalize it to human experience, because we have this in common. And then the next one is called the limbic system, or what's also sometimes referred to as the emotional brain, because these areas are what give a rise to certain emotions, especially emotions that are very important for survival, like fear, anxiety, arousal. And this is a more of a mammalian specialty. So let's say lizards don't have a very developed area like this, but primates, apes, this is already much more developed in them. This is what's responsible for a lot of the emotional states that we as humans also experience. But the key part is this neocortex, which is also referred to sometimes as the new brain. This is something that you only find in primate, apes, and of course mostly developed in humans. And a lot of the networks related to creativity that I'm going to describe, all of that actually happens in the cortex. Even though, important to note that all of these 3 layers, they interact with each other, like in both directions. So the level 1 might influence level 2, level 3, and level 3 can also influence level 2, level 1. For example, if you are having, let's say, heart issues, heart palpitations, that will also influence the emotions that you're feeling in the moment and the thoughts that you're having. But especially in humans, the reverse also works very well and very quickly. For example, even an abstract idea of an emotional state, for example, you're watching a movie and it's something that's making you very happy or very sad. It's just an abstract idea, right? It's not an actual, I don't know, lion chasing you in the desert or whatever. But even that abstract idea can influence this limbic system, the emotional mechanism, whose in turn also influences this reptilian structures, and you get an increased heart rate, or you get anxious, or you get very happy, you know. So all of this interconnects, but the cortex is what's highly developed in humans. And here you can see the comparison in sizes as well on the left side. Elephants are actually quite interesting because they have a huge brain. This big part, although it's like the cerebellum, which also is important for movement and balance, but they have a fairly developed cortical structure as well. So they're actually quite smart. But in humans, it's most developed and what allows for all this other complex behavior to happen. So the networks that I've already mentioned, there are like three main networks that neuroscientists have identified. And the first one is what we call the default mode network. I also want to check if we have any questions. Okay, I don't see any questions, so.
I have one.
Yeah.
You want me to ask now?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, so the question was, as you talked about the myth, like left brain versus right side brain, the question was, what about the myth about male and female brains?
Oh yeah, that's not correct, because, you know, if you look at the scan or even just slices of brains, let's say in animals, just by looking at it, you won't be able to tell if it's male or female. So there are not this like very specific distinctive things. It's just there are certain traits that we can study that statistically you will maybe see some differences on a general population level, but individually, maybe the only thing that I could say is that it's true that on average male brains are bigger, but it doesn't mean that it's sort of correlates with more intelligence or anything. It's mostly also because on average males are bigger and taller, so it influences the size as well overall. But in terms of all the other functional things, it's sort of also highly simplified and stereotypical. But once we get also onto some personality traits related to creativity, I can mention a few things that's different in males and females. So let's look at the networks. The default mode network is very important and very interesting. This is what we can be observed, let's say if you're in a scanner, when you're just sitting and not doing anything. When you're sitting and not doing anything still, your brain is not still. There is a lot of activity happening. It's just it's activity in like different parts of the brain. What they think it's associated with is, again, just daydreaming, mind wandering, imagination, just imagining potential scenarios, which is, again, is the structures that allow humans to have that. And imagination is what allows to plan future, like imagine and plan future accordingly and make predictions and all of those things. The next one, I'm going to refer to the one on the right, the central executive network, which is also something that's mostly associated with the prefrontal cortex, which is, again, highly developed in humans. It's what regulates our attention. It's what allows us to keep track of the strategies that we're using. It's responsible also for the working memory and keeping track of something that we're like information that we're working with in the moment. So maintains attention on a prioritized task. And then the salience network, which has been discussed more recently, is what essentially tags certain things in our environment as interesting or not interesting. Because imagine if you're paying attention to everything all the time, you can't really function, right? Based on the task that you're trying to achieve, your brain needs to figure out what's more important and what's relevant to your goal. So all these three networks are very essential in the process of creativity, and during the process of, let's say, you creating something, there can be a lot of like switching around. For example, there are modes, let's say if you're in a flow state and really kind of focused inwards and really like in the moment, the default mode network functioning in that area is increased. But maybe if you're then trying to sort of analyze the process or integrate some feedback from outside, then your executive network might be more active in that moment and then switch back again and again. So it's quite complex. Again, you know, we don't have like exact understanding of every single thing, but there are good methodologies of understanding and having some more kind of sophisticated explanations of what might be happening. So I want to bring an example of how like an actual neuroscientist or neuropsychologist would be studying this. For example, an interesting experiment was looking at rappers just in general, because it gives you a chance. You can do both ways. You can ask rappers, or for example jazz musicians, because improvisation, like that creative process, is very common in jazz as well. You can bring them in and ask them to perform pieces that they've already memorized before. So it's not really creative, they've already learned this, it's just working from the memory. And also do pieces that's new, that they're just freestyling it. It's done spontaneously. And you can put them in an MRI scan and compare the activities in that moment. So that can give you a good understanding of what's really happening. And it's through experiments like this that we know about all these networks and have a better idea of what's really happening. And this experiment was quite interesting because as you know, I mean, these MRI scans are huge and very, very noisy. So what we call ecological validity is low. Ecological validity is referring to the fact of how close to a natural environment a lab environment is, which in a lot of cases it's not as close, right? Because still, you know that you're in a laboratory, it affects your natural and creative processes or whatever. So the researchers here were very rigorous. What they tried to do, they did a few things. One, they made sure that the beat that they chose for the freestyle rap was matching the noise that the MRI machine was making, so that it wasn't distracting for the performers. Another thing was that they made some other complicated experiments, sort of like as further improvement, where they also gave the performance images at the same time as were they performing, so to see how they can integrate that into their rap or jazz music in the moment. And also in one experiment, they had audience, like live audience of other professional musicians, giving them feedback in real time. So this is an example where, for example, a musician is trying to integrate that feedback. It's their executive network that would be very active, because they need that for tracking that information and actually integrating that. And then there are moments when they're completely engaged in the process of the freestyling, of spontaneously improvising, that their default mode network and lateral areas of the prefrontal cortex, which are kind of like front but to the sides, are highly, highly active. And that activation is associated with, again, imagination and creativity. So this is a very cool example of what you could do. And then, yeah, what I also want to focus on is certain characteristics that are associated with creativity in general. Daydreaming, I already mentioned that, especially the default mode network is also active when we're just kind of sitting and daydreaming. It's essential to creativity and even developing creativity. So one kind of terrible thing you could do to a child when, you know, it might be a child with creative nature, but you can easily crush it if you constantly tell them not to daydream and just pay attention in school, because this is a natural process, and daydreaming, in fact, can be very, very beneficial. Another thing is that the networks that are active during creative tasks are also associated with other areas that have important roles in just exploration and novelty seeking. For example, this ventral striatal reward system. I mean, we don't have to get into the terms, but the interesting thing here is that even very primitive animals, like this nematode here. Nematodes are like 1 millimeter long only. They have less than 400 neurons. Think about that. That's less than 400 neurons. We have billions and billions, and this is less than 400 neurons. But even this primitive structure, they don't just go find food and then, let's say, rest. They also have these long processes when they're just exploring their environment. So this explorative process, it's something that's really built into like natural organisms. And so even, let's say, when we're bored at work or doing something, when we're disengaged, it's plausible to say that this is not a bug of the kind of hardware, but it's really a feature, because the way it's built, it's for us, and just animals in general, the exploration process and seeking novelty is very, very important. And the other interesting thing is that creativity is highly correlated with risk-taking, which makes sense. I mean, any creative process, it's high risk, high reward. And that's why even in the creative world, let's say if you think artists, writers or musicians, it's only 1% of those artists that really sort of are able to monetize that and reach incredible success. And it's like 1% has half of the money that like art generates, and then it's like 1% of 1% that has the other half. So it's really high risk, high reward. And while it's important and it's a very kind of human, natural thing for us to have this need for creativity, it also might not be as common as you think in terms of kind of that like rare level of creativity, creative genius, because it's high risk and high reward. So what I want to get into is that just personality traits and what's associated with creativity, because probably all of us have that on some, like on different kind of levels, on different scales. But what is highly correlated with creativity, one is intelligence, actual IQ score. And there are a lot of issues with like IQ score in general, but they do have some accuracy on, again, like general population level, predictive accuracy. So it's been shown again and again that creativity is highly correlated with IQ, but IQ alone is not enough to predict it. So besides IQ, another important personality trait is openness that's really correlated. And just a side note, I want to explain this a little. There's 5 dimensions of personality. It's also referred to as OCEAN, because you see this is like the acronym, or the big 5 personality traits. This is the only kind of accepted psychometric measure of personality. So if any of you are into Myers-Briggs personality test or any similar test, just for you to know, those are considered pseudoscience. They have some correlation with this, but this big 5 personality trait sort of like scheme is the only one that's been measured and verified statistically by psychologists and other social scientists. So openness is the one that's highly, highly correlated with creativity. Conscientiousness, for example, is the reverse. Someone who is highly conscientious might be less creative, because conscientiousness is associated with organization and very like logical, structured thinking. So that might have sort of like reverse effects on cognitive, versus openness is about openness to new experiences, new ideas. And I guess maybe it's partially bad news, but it is the case that this personality traits are more or less consistent throughout lifetime. So let's say if you're an if like you're an introverted person, you can't quite just learn to be extroverted and really enjoy it. You can learn to be like very socially skilled and have like sophisticated social life, but you won't necessarily enjoy it. If it's more or less built in. There's a lot of like biological predisposition and also early environment influence, like when we're maybe till age 5, 7, where it really influences. And then after all, it's more or less consistent throughout lifetime. So if you happen to be someone highly, highly conscientious and high level of IQ, very creative fields might not be perfectly sort of your thing, really. But there are other very important fields that have high correlation with that are not creative, but still important. For example, lawyers, they have very high IQs, but they score lower on openness. They score high on conscientiousness. So that's not a field where creativity is essential or even helpful. Or for example, accounting, banking. You don't want a creative accountant unless you're doing something illegal. You don't want a creative accountant. So for certain fields, there are other important qualities that are essential, but creativity has the reverse. And again, side note, just related to female brain, male brain, in terms of personality traits, again, on like general population level, for example, what we know is that on average, women are more agreeable than men. So this is not really related to creativity, but that's something that we can say. Doesn't mean every woman is more agreeable than a man, but on average, that is true. And the rest are actually, I don't think there's a clear like gender distinction. So, okay, I'm gonna move on. Again, any questions before this? Any clarifications? Okay, good, let's go. So other key principles that are important to mention is one, that contrary to what your intuition might be, too much freedom is actually not good for creativity. So some freedom is important, right? Like just ability to daydream and be in an environment where free thinking is allowed and nurtured. But there's problem if it's too much freedom, because you need constraints for the creativity to happen. Without constraints, the research has shown that people become complacent and they sort of choose the path to least resistance. So if you give them a task, but it doesn't have very clear specifications, they just end up going with the first idea that they had, the most intuitive thing, instead of investigating it further and going deeper. And again, I think one explanation to this is that, remember the salience network that we were discussing? I'm going to go back here. The salience network. As I said, it's what's responsible for tagging things that are interesting in your environment. So if you don't have those constraints, it's like your brain doesn't have, it doesn't know what to tag. It doesn't know what's relevant and what's important. And if you have too many things, then it's much harder to juggle, and then your result won't be as innovative or creative. So constraints are important. And then another thing is that our brains naturally want to minimize uncertainty. That's sort of like something that brain is constantly trying to do in every task, the whole environment, because world is full of uncertainties. Everything essentially is uncertain. So brain is constantly engaged in this process of like trying to predict of what's going to happen next and like find some level of uncertainty through like generating these probabilities. And sometimes that is very tricky, because that's what can lead to confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is referring to situation when we only pay attention to things that already confirm what we know, even though it might be wrong. But let's say it could be something political, or you're trying to learn something, but you're seeing an opinion that's contradictory to yours, but you ignore that. You focus on the ones that are confirming, and it gives you the sense that, yeah, I must be wrong because look at all this evidence. But that's because you're ignoring everything that might be contradicting that. So that's sort of the downside of the brain really seeking to minimize the uncertainty and avoid it. But the only way to counteract that is to stay curious, is to be, again, the openness plays a role. Stay open and ask the I don't knows, and to stay with I don't know when you don't know something. And this is where the idea comes from, that creativity starts with not knowing. There's this Polish poet, Nobel-winning poet, Wisława Szymborska, I think. I'm sorry if I'm butchering her name, but she put it really beautifully. She said, inspiration is nothing but a continuous I don't know. And there is a text from her that I put here. It's kind of long, but I really want to read it because the way she put it, it's so beautiful. I can't put it. And I think this is from her Nobel Prize speech. So she says, all sorts of torturers, dictators, fanatics, and demagogues struggling for power by way of few loudly shouted slogans also enjoy their jobs, and they do perform their duties with inventive fervor. Well, yes, but they know. They know, and whatever they know is enough for them once and for all. They don't know to find out about anything else, since that might diminish the argument's force. And any knowledge that doesn't lead to new questions quickly dies out. It fails to maintain the temperature required for sustaining life. In the most extreme cases well known for ancient history and modern history, it even poses a lethal threat to society. So this is kind of, she's referring to that confirmation bias that I'm talking about, but she's putting it so beautifully, and also in the historical perspective of like what a detrimental effect it might have for all of humanity, like us being sure and trying to avoid uncertainty. And then she continues, this is why I value the little phrase, I don't know, so highly. It's small, but it flies on mighty wings. It expands our lives to include the spaces within us, as well as those outer expanses in which our tiny earth hangs suspended. If Isaac Newton had never said to himself, I don't know, the apples in his orchard might have dropped to the ground like hailstones, and at best he would have never stopped to pick them up and gobble them with gusto. Had my compatriot Marie Sklodowska-Curie never said to herself, I don't know, she probably would have wound up teaching chemistry at some private high school for young ladies for good families, and would have ended her days performing this otherwise perfectly respectable job. But she kept on saying, I don't know, and these words led her not just once but twice to Stockholm, where restless, questing spirits are occasionally rewarded with the Nobel Prize. This, I get chills just by reading this. She put it so beautifully, but again, this is just emphasizes the importance of that I don't know, and sticking and cultivating that curiosity. Curiosity is essential, and again, associated with that trait openness that we already talked about. And next important thing, so this is again about kind of breaking down some myths and urban legend, is that we like this romantic notion that, you know, genius is kind of alone, like it's like a thing for a lone wolf. It's this amazing figure that just happens to have this amazing brain power and does this and that. But that's often not the case. So first one is, the myth of the lone inventor. But if we go deeper into history and even look at the most famous figures like Edison, Einstein, Steve Jobs, let's say, it's true, for example, that Edison was a brand name, but a lot of the patents that he had, he didn't create all of that. A lot of it was already based on existing patents by other inventors and scientists, and he was really good at getting them all together and spotting innovations. He definitely was very talented and had this creative nature. But the important breakthroughs that happened, it wasn't just done by one person. It's collaboration plays a very important role. And the other thing is, again, this romantic notion of a eureka moment, of a big idea that just comes and changes everything. But that's also not true, because in every case, if you look deeper, it's not one big idea that just suddenly happened, but it's lots and lots of little incremental changes that then in conglomeration lead to an emergence of an idea that at a certain point at the right time, it changes the direction of everything that we've known. But again, it's due to all these little moments that have all accumulated already. And the other thing is myth of experts on solutions. This is particularly relevant if, let's say, you're working in a team and you believe that because you have the specific background, only you're qualified for like generating ideas and coming up with solutions, and ignoring other potential perspectives, which could be very wrong, because you never know what other background people have. And you, even if you're an expert in the field, might have false constraints and think that something is not possible because you haven't experienced that. But someone who doesn't know what's possible and not might come up with these new creative ideas that actually make a difference. So again, openness to that and not following these false constraints is essential, even though constraints themselves on the creative process, as we discussed, are important. So no lone inventors and no big aha moments. It's all about collaboration and little incremental changes that then make a difference. And for example, Steve Jobs, considered one of the most innovative people. And again, it's like one of the first examples that would come to your mind. But again, Steve Jobs, he had certain skills that were important for what they achieved. For example, he was great at, again, spotting patterns and getting together the right team of people, but he himself wouldn't have been able to do everything that Apple has achieved. Wozniak was the one who actually was the engineer behind the idea and developed the first computers. Johnny Ive is still the chief designer of the Apple, and he designed a lot of the Apple products that we love and use. Tony Fadell, also an investor, engineer, he was the one who invented the iPod, iPhone, etc., etc. So again, all these people that again have creative nature and talent, but it's in conglomeration that something amazing and kind of game-changing happens, not by one person. So this is on a more practical side, but again, sort of continuing the idea that genius is not necessarily just innate and fixed, that maybe it can be taught and cultivated, is these examples. And this is what I call like the innovation toolbox. And the question behind this is, can we teach innovation? And again, even though I think some traits, like personality traits that are correlated with that, are fairly fixed and consistent over a lifetime, but there are a lot of important tools that if you practice and cultivate can increase your level of innovative thinking and creativity. So there are some examples here. I just don't know. Let me just make sure we're not running out of time. Okay, maybe I won't go through every example, but some of these are interesting. For example, what we call frame shift or paradigm shift. Now, a lot of the ideas that we're used to in our lives that are, again, dependent on the context and culture that we live in, we're so used to them that we can't even imagine another way of seeing that. And a lot of that can even be described through metaphors. For example, for the longest time in cancer research, the metaphor that was commonly used and the way it was conceptualized, it was war on cancer, because cancer was seen as this enemy that we need to fight. But this example, it's another metaphor that says good fences make good neighbors, which seems kind of counterintuitive, and it's actually taken from a poem by Robert Frost. What does this really mean? Good fences make good neighbors. Turns out what he was referring to is that if you have good set boundaries between you and your neighbor, doesn't matter if you're getting along or not, that will sort of keep you away from trouble. And what happened at some point is that some scientists, when they're looking at novel approaches for cancer research, I guess maybe not directly inspired but by this metaphor, but again, they found this new perspective of looking at it. And they used this idea of a fence that now stands for the immune system, and they started developing novel cancer research, novel cancer treatments that instead of trying to sort of destroy the cancer cells, started looking for ways that the immune system might become a barrier between the host and the cancer cells, and that way kind of tackle the development of it. So these examples are mostly scientific, but again, quite interesting. Another one is on this left side is this bacteria called H. pylori, and the scientist who discovered this got a Nobel Prize because it turns out that this bacteria is what causes 80% of stomach ulcers. And what led them to this was ability for keen observation. because the scientists were just, regular, not very famous, not very known, but they were working with this. One of them was a pathologist just looking at slices of stomach cells, and he was noticing these little dots, which he thought that it just must be from his own slices. For the longest time, they were thinking that there can't be bacteria because the pH in the stomach is very low. But he kept noticing and noticing and noticing because his eye was used to it. He knew it's not supposed to be there, and turned out it wasn't just from his slices. And they end up, him and his colleague, looking at this deeper and then making the discovery, which got them to a Nobel Prize. So another techniques are like that are analogy, reversal, reorganization, brainstorming, like brainstorming with the group. So again, a collaborative process, and harmonizing. This refers to applying the scientific method, really. If you can't come up with an insight right away, very quickly, what might help is kind of going through the analytical steps and generating lots of hypotheses and then testing it to see what can work and what not. The idea is that all of this is a more deliberate process, but if you practice this at some point, it might become sort of more subconscious and lead to higher creativity. Again, if we have time, we can go into more details, but a lot of these examples are kind of from the scientific context, but again, relevant to other areas as well. But I want to get into this. So this is, again, I thought was quite interesting, an important idea as well from the Pixar co-founder Ed Catmull, who is essentially saying how in a group environment, in a company or wherever you're working, to foster creativity, it's important to have a positive perspective on failure. Because without that, without making those mistakes, it'll be much, much harder to investigate and come to those novel ideas. And what I found interesting is this last part, especially when he says, management's job is not to prevent risk, but to build the ability to recover. So in very successful companies which rely on creative insight and creativity to generate ideas and products and hence their revenues, this is what plays an essential role, not just ability and the structure to help people avoid all kinds of mistakes and risks, but no, to encourage that so they have enough freedom to explore, but also the resources to recover and move on. But again, this is very important. So we talked a little about like the biology and the natural predispositions, but the natural predisposition to creativity might not have a chance to manifest itself if it's not in the right environment. Even think of Leonardo da Vinci. Chances are, if you were born like 200 years earlier or later, we wouldn't have had the body of work that we have now due to Leonardo da Vinci. Because there were a lot of specificities in that time that allowed all of this to happen. And at a time, Leonardo wasn't the only one creating such important body of work, and not just in arts, but also in sciences and engineering. Because he was creating during what's called the Renaissance period. Another example of that is the 19th century Vienna, which, if you want to learn more about, there's this amazing book called The Age of Insight, written by Eric Kandel, who is also another Nobel-winning neuroscientist, whom I've actually had the privilege to meet. He's an amazing guy, also very funny. And this is written very beautifully. So 19th century Vienna, it was home to a lot of scientists, artists. It was the cultural capital of Europe at a time. And what's essential here is that there was a lot of opportunity for them to come together and freely discuss ideas. And it's this environment that catalyzed a lot of creative thinking and led to breakthroughs. For example, the 1900 Vienna, this is when Freud came up with his like shocking insights on like the repressed subconscious ideas. That still some of it is relevant to today. I mean, not all of it is accurate, but it was an essential contribution to today's like psychology and psychiatry. It was also Gustav Klimt was creating his art at the same time, and he was also looking to similar seeking to answer similar questions, but from the art perspective. And a lot of this interactions is what catalyzed and led to new and old discoveries in like brain biology and psychology. And it was the same in the Renaissance period, because what was very helpful was that the city authorities were helping the artists by creating competitions and actually paying them so that they weren't starving artists. They had all the opportunities to create. And in result, because of their creations, this was also in return creating a lot of more economic prosperity. So this is something that I think in more recent years, in the last century, there is this separation between like art and science, and it's not a positive thing. It's the opposite. It's very negative, because we've lost sight of how important it might be for the economic prosperity, actually. And it's also in the current educational system where arts and science are very separated. I mean, I think a lot of you would probably have had similar experiences when me growing up. Like, I was interested in art, but no parent takes that seriously because they just want their child to grow up and actually have a job that pays. And in today's world, it's hard to monetize creative work, like genuine creative work. But art and science are not as separate as may seem at all. For example, Niels Bohr was inspired by Cubism when he came up with his complementarity in quantum theory, the idea that a particle can be something can be a wave and a particle at the same time. Because there's this idea in Cubism that the artist is trying to paint something from different perspectives simultaneously. But when you, as the beholder, look at it, you only choose one perspective. And Niels Bohr used that same analogy, sort of using that analogy tool, and realized that it can be said the same about the electron, where you can measure it both as a particle and a wave. But when you're measuring, you have to choose one or the other. You have to choose a perspective while measuring it, but it can be thought of as both. And Proust is another idea, because in his book, In Search of Lost Time, in the very beginning, he is describing this experience when he was eating this French cake and drinking coffee, and the smell and the taste of it was giving rise to this memories in him, this involuntary memories, what he called. He said this like decades, like 100 years before neuroscientists actually came to understand and prove this on a biological level. It's actually true now. We know that the olfactory bulb that detects smell is very close to the hippocampus, which is important for memory storing. And he had the intuitive understanding of this, and it was expressed in literature way before science understood this. So this is very interesting and just shows how art and science are not as separate as we think at all. And again, in the Renaissance period, people like Leonardo, Michelangelo, they didn't see those as separate things. For them, it was the same, and art and science fed into each other and helped each other. So kind of coming to the end, what I want to summarize here is that this paradoxical modes of thinking in creativity. Frank Barron, who is one of the pioneers of researching creativity, he said, creative genius may be at once, there's a typo, naive and knowledgeable, being at home equally to primitive symbolism and to rigorous logic. He's both primitive and more cultured, more destructive and more constructive, occasionally crazier and yet adamantly saner than the average person. But what this really highlights is this seemingly contradictory nature of creativity as well, where you need a lot of spontaneity and freedom of thinking, but you also need constraints. Say even in jazz, you need the spontaneity, but also discipline plays an important role. Because the best jazz musicians are the ones that are highly, highly skilled in their instrument. But because they know and they have all this body of knowledge, they also have the ability to then just play around and break down and blend together those different pieces. So we're almost at the end, I think. Yeah. And so I think I covered lots of things. I'm sorry if any of that became confusing, but hopefully we have some time and we can discuss, and I can go a bit more into some of the stuff that you thought was interesting. But thank you a lot for listening to all of this and being here. And yeah.
Thank you, Annie. We can give a few minutes for participants if they have any questions to ask in the chat. But meanwhile, I would basically like to share a comment by my side as I was listening to you, because it was very interesting for me to hear the scientific side of it, which came as a reassurance to me of a book which is called The Artist's Way. I don't know if you know about it. It's by Julia Cameron, who basically says, like, we really need to stop that creativity is by nature, you're born with it, and then you come with this right versus left side of things. And she basically says what you say scientifically, that people need to put themselves out there, be curious, take risks. And she basically comes up with exercises and stuff, but real fun ones. So it basically reminded me of the book, and I was like, oh, maybe basically it has scientific proof in it. So, it was interesting to hear this. And I also want to thank you for debunking a lot of myth. So,
my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. I check my chat. I have no questions. Do you?
I don't think I see any questions. Yeah, but feel free, anyone. If you want, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you. But also what I wanted to say in summary is that, based on the traits and sort of the biology, there might be some predispositions in some people sort of for more creativity. But I think what's essential today is that the current system that we have right now, both like educational and sort of just the way we work, sometimes it can crush creativity even in the people who have that predisposition. So that's why understanding it and finding the ways to sort of revive it in you and foster it, if you think you're someone who has that inclination, is very, very important not to lose that, because it's easy to lose that. As I said, even as kids, a lot of the times we're discouraged from that kind of thinking for other practical reasons, which, let's say, adults would think is beneficial for us, but it might have the reverse effects. So.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay,
I guess we have no questions. So thank you again. It was
my
very
pleasure.
Interesting. Thanks for putting your time and energy and knowledge into this.
My pleasure. If anyone has questions later, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to discuss more creativity ideas with any of you. So also, if anyone is applying to UWC this year, good luck. And
Yeah, and there is a comment from a participant, no questions, but thanks a lot.
Great, thank you as well. Thank you for coming. Okay,
great. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.